Welcome back to Bible 201, Introduction to New Testament Literature. This week we are considering the Gospel of Mark, the second Gospel in the order as they appear in the New Testament, with particular attention given to the teaching of Jesus. I assume you've already looked at the E360 material, so you know what things we're focused on, what you're to be familiar with, and hopefully what you're increase your knowledge with this week as you consider both the readings and the assignments, discussion questions, working towards taking the daily test. The Gospel of Mark, we will talk a little bit first about some of the distinctive elements in the Gospel of Mark that make it different from the other Gospels. And then we'll turn our attention looking particularly at two issues that I would like to spend a little extra time on as outlined in the E360 page, and that is looking at the idea of the Son of Man, Jesus' use of this title, the Son of Man, to speak of his own life, ministry, and expectation, and finally to look a little bit at the parables. When we talk about the Gospel of Mark, there are several characteristics that distinguish it, set it apart from the other Gospels. I've given you a list of those. You can do some further study on your own, but I'd like to just go over them briefly here. Usually the most prominent characteristic that's mentioned in connection with Mark is that it's the shortest gospel. It is the shortest gospel, but it's not the briefest gospel. By that I mean when you compare accounts that appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or perhaps just two of the Gospels, Mark and a parallel, oftentimes Mark's account is not the shortest, the briefest gospel. He tends to inflate his stories to provide details. Usually they're literary details or given for color. For instance, when the story of the woman with the issue of blood who comes up and touches the hem of his garment, we have a long description about everything that she's gone through, trying to get healing and relief before she resorts to encountering Jesus. We think in terms of the story of the Transfiguration, where Jesus' garments, according to Mark, become so white, they're whiter than any bleach can get them. It sounds a bit like a television commercial. When Jesus falls asleep on the boat, he puts his head on a pillow in Mark's gospel. When Jesus has the multitude sit down for the feeding of the 5,000, he has them sit on green grass. So again, these details are not hugely significant in the overall story, but it reflects to us a little bit of Mark's style in recounting these events. He's the shortest gospel in the sense that he leaves out blocks of material, particularly when it comes to the teachings of Jesus, the sayings material. Oftentimes those sayings will show up in parallel accounts in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. He eliminates those, omits those. There's a large scholarly discussion as to why Mark chooses to eliminate those elements, the teaching elements. Sometimes in the discussion of the development of the gospel tradition and the look for sources to the Gospels, what each of the evangelists used in the composition of their gospel, it's suggested that Matthew and Luke had a common source, apart from Mark, that they relied upon Mark, and then another source, which in German would be called Quelle source. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as Q in your literature and your readings. Probably for the last 150 years, it's been a standard assumption of New Testament scholarship, whether evangelical, conservative, liberal, doesn't really matter. Pretty much across the board, I would say 95% of scholarship assumes that Mark is the first gospel and was used by Matthew and Luke together with another saying source. Just I will interject and say that is not my assumption when I'm working with the gospel, but it's important for me to tell you that that is the majority opinion. The discussion of the synoptic gospels and their literary relationship as historical sources is a whole different topic, which we don't have time to delve in today, but it's a topic that is addressed by a considerable number of scholars. One of the things that we notice also about Mark's gospel is, unlike Matthew and Luke, he has no account of the birth or the childhood of Jesus, the early days of Jesus. Instead, he begins almost immediately with the baptismal ministry of John the Baptist, the account of John's preaching, and then Jesus' baptism, and then he shifts and pivots immediately to the ministry of Jesus. In that, he is similar to John's gospel, the fourth gospel. Although John has a prologue in the first chapter, the story itself begins with the preaching of John and the baptism of Jesus. So they share that in common. Both of the Gospels do not include any account regarding the birth and the childhood of Jesus. The author of Mark's Gospel seems to have witnessed, have seen for himself the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple in 70 CE. There are hints and elements in his Gospel that seem to intimate that he's familiar with, that he has already witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem. This may say something to us about the time in which Mark was written. I don't usually get too fixated on dates and trying to fix dates of when different works are written, but I would suggest to you that there are clear indications that Mark is written post 70. But that's one of the reasons, is that it seems that he has witnessed the destruction of Jerusalem. In his gospel, he downplays Jesus's adherence to matters of Jewish law. In Hebrew, we call it halakha. The precepts following those. He has the famous statement where Jesus declares all foods clean, which is a bit of an unusual statement coming from any Jew with a sensitivity to the commandments. But he has other elements in the gospel as well that he sort of downplays or marginalizes aspects of Jewish law in telling the life of Jesus. On the other hand, he does highlight the Gentile mission, the taking of the gospel to the nations, and has distinctive elements in his gospel that seem to give prominence to that idea. One of the more interesting ideas in Mark's gospel is a continuing theme of what scholars call the messianic secret, the idea that Jesus did not want his disciples to tell people who he was, that they were not to speak about him. This is something that is distinctive to Mark's presentation of the gospel, the story of the life of Jesus. He differs from Matthew and Luke in the report regarding Jesus's words from the cross. He presents a lament from the cross, quoting Psalm 22, and something that is not present in the parallel Gospels. On the whole, Mark has what seems to be a theme, a thread that runs through his gospel, in which Jesus is cast as a type of Jeremiah, a lonely, holy man who's abandoned by his contemporaries. In the gospel, Jesus is rejected by his family, by his townspeople, by Peter and the other disciples, by the crowds in Jerusalem, both not only the leadership in the temple authorities, but also the populace of Jerusalem itself, the two men on the cross, and even God himself, with his declaration at the end, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So you have this thread that runs through the gospel where Jesus is abandoned by everyone. And again, that's something that is a distinctive presentation, an account that we find in Mark's gospel, which does not seem to find its way in the other presentations of the gospel. Finally, Mark, distinctive from the other gospels, does not have a clear account of the resurrection. He leaves us with the women in fear and an empty tomb. There is a problem at the end of Mark's gospel that the manuscripts we have are fragmented and truncated. So the question of the ending of Mark's gospel is a bit of a question mark. You'll notice in most of your Bibles there are footnotes at the end of Mark's gospel, and they will perhaps in the footnotes give you longer and shorter endings to the gospel. So that's a Greek manuscript issue. For whatever reason, they have been damaged in time. But the gospel as we have it leaves us without a clear resurrection, a clear account of the resurrection. We have an empty tomb, and that's it. Probably I would conclude on my sort of introductory statements about Mark, the fact that Mark does not have any account of the birth, the virgin birth, the miraculous birth of Jesus, and also seems to be lacking a clear account of the resurrection, probably made it an appealing gospel in the 19th century to German scholarship, continental scholarship, that tended to be a bit more liberal, skeptical about the historical aspects of the gospel. And for them, this was a very appealing gospel because they didn't have to address the issue of the virgin birth, the complexities of explaining the virgin birth, as well as the resurrection. And my sense is that was one of the contributing factors for the popularity of Mark and sort of the prominence that was given to Mark in the presentation of the development of the gospel tradition. So that scholarship today speaks of Mark being the oldest, most primitive, and most reliable account of the life of Jesus. Again, this would not be my estimation, nor my understanding of how the gospel tradition develops. But that sort of gives you some idea of perhaps why some of the positions are taken that you'll read prominently in the literature, not just among liberal scholarship, but also even among evangelical scholars. They will speak of Mark in priority, and Matthew and Luke's use of Mark as the earliest gospel, together with this sayings material, Q, Quella's saying source in the composition of their gospels. We shift now to our consideration of a couple of ideas I think that are important to look at when we talk about the teaching of Jesus, and one is the Son of Man. This title, which most of you have heard or familiar with, it appears frequently in the Gospels, 78 times by count in the Gospels. It seems to be Jesus' favorite self-ascription, his favorite title for himself, certainly far more than Jesus referring to himself as the Christ or the Messiah. He prefers to refer to himself as the Son of Man. One of the ironic elements is that while this is Jesus' favorite title for himself, his most famous follower, his most famous apostle, Peter, never uses the title the Son of Man for Jesus. I don't think it's a theological reason. I think it's an issue of language. I think the idea of the Son of Man, as we're going to talk in just a minute, is embedded, or it's a creation that comes out of a Semitic language environment, likely Hebrew, I would argue Hebrew, and that it has an idiomatic sense to it, an idea to it that is only fully expressed in that Semitic language environment. And Paul, on the other hand, is writing to an audience that probably did not know Hebrew. He's writing to Gentiles in the Greco-Roman world, and for them, Greek was the language of communication. And to be blunt, the title in Greek, Huios tu anthropou, really is nonsensical in Greek. It really does not have the resonance. It doesn't have the idiomatic sense, the profound idea that we find it in Hebrew, Ben Ha'adam. So let's look at it a little bit more closely. Scholarship typically speaks of Jesus' use of the term Son of Man in three different ways. At its heart, at its center, it reflects the Hebrew idea of Ben Adam or Ben Ha'adam, a human being. And we find this frequently in the Hebrew Bible. I've given you a couple of passages here, Numbers 23:19 and Psalm 8:4, where it just reflects humanity, a human being, without any significance. You might say that in these instances, that should not be capitalized in any sense. It's a generic term that just means a human being. And I think there are a couple of occasions where Jesus uses this title to speak of his humanity without anything special regarding himself, but that he shares our humanity. I think one of the better examples is when Judas comes in the garden and seeks to signal, to identify Jesus and his group there, and he has behind him the temple authorities and the guards, and he approaches Jesus to give him what is the expected, very common greeting, not shaking hands, but the kissing on either cheek, which you can still see today in the Middle East, the type of greeting. And he approaches Jesus to kiss him, and Jesus responds, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" In other words, would you betray a fellow human being with a sign of affection? And he drives home the duplicity, the hypocrisy, the treachery in Judas's heart by sort of juxtaposed these two things, this idea of betrayal and a warm greeting, a kissing on the cheek. So I think Jesus uses this on a handful of occasions to speak of himself as one like us, an everyman, one who shares all of our experience of being fully human. He also uses the term to speak, particularly looking towards the future, of one who will be designated and appointed to deliver divine judgment, will sit in judgment. We have the passage in Luke 22:69 where Jesus responds to Caiaphas, but from now on, the Son of Man, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. That portrayal of seating, being seated there, is a position of judgment, executing divine judgment. We hear this already in Daniel 7:13 about the Son of Man who is coming, and this is a portrayal of an individual who is invested with authority, responsibility to carry out divine judgment. Jesus speaks of that, and I think he clearly understands and anticipates that he himself will be that individual. So thus far we have the idea of the Son of Man as a human being. We also have the idea of one who will be appointed, invested with authority to deliver divine judgment. The third one really is the enigma. The third use of the Son of Man is something that is distinct to Jesus, which proves to be a bit of a problem for New Testament scholarship. They generally like to see analogies, sort of parallels, so they can understand a little bit more clearly whether we're talking about the meaning of words or expressions. And when an individual steps forward and does something or says something that has no parallel, it usually presents a bit of a challenge for scholarship. No one in contemporary usage, at least in all the literature we have, uses the term the Son of Man in the context of suffering. And Jesus, from the events of the Transfiguration around that time, he begins to speak of his future suffering, his anticipation that he will come to Jerusalem, be rejected by the leadership, and be subjected to suffering and death. He uses the term Son of Man to speak of himself in that context. Again, there is no parallel for that. We have nothing in Jewish literature, nothing in parallel contemporary literature where this idea of the Son of Man used in the context of suffering is to be found. I have my own ideas. You've read a couple pages. I gave you a short article to read about that. I think that the idea of the suffering Son of Man is a development that grows out of Jewish notions, Jewish experience, particularly the persecutions in the 2nd century BCE, around the time of the persecutions of Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, where Jews who refuse to abandon the commandments, refuse to abandon the scriptures, refuse to abandon keeping the Sabbath or circumcising their sons, are subjected to martyrdom. They are executed. And we have, in a sense, a crisis of faith. People are encouraging others to hold on, to be strong in the face of persecution and death. And we start hearing about biblical figures who are recounted in these martyrologies, these speeches that are given, and they recount the various heroes of the nation who in difficult times stood fast and held on and were faithful to God. And we hear about individuals, again, from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, and these ideas are to encourage the martyrs, and they revolve around the idea of the unjust suffering of the righteous. And one of the figures that comes to prominence is the figure of Abel, who, interestingly enough, his patronymic, his name is the son of Adam, or in Hebrew, Ben Adam, which is the exact same form that we find of the Son of Man. So it's a bit of an idiomatic expression, which I think has some depth to it, some sophistication to it as an expression. But Abel, as we start hearing about Abel as the exemplar, the perfect example of the righteous martyr, It's one of the fascinating things about the mentioning of Abel, is that he is routinely described as righteous, even though in Genesis 4, where Abel appears, there is no description of him as righteous. When we find these little additions, developments to terms or titles or phrases in the Hebrew Bible, they usually hint to us of larger ideas. And I think surrounding the figure of Abel and his righteousness is to suggest that he didn't deserve what he got. He didn't deserve what Cain did to him, that he died in his righteousness. And of course, that's not where the story ends. We hear the expression that Abel's blood still cries out from the ground. He still is looking to God for vindication. It's the idea that God cannot stand back and watch his righteous ones suffer unjustly, but that he is drawn into the world in redemptive engagement to vindicate the death of his righteous ones. I think with the term the Son of Man and Abel, again, two sides of one coin, son of Adam, son of man. With Abel, what's fascinating is that we began to hear portrayals about Abel, the victim, being raised up and sitting on the throne of judgment, executing divine judgment. So we find him functioning in the role of the Son of Man, the judge, that we have already considered as the second way in which Jesus refers to the Son of Man. So in some ways, it's two sides of one coin, where the victim himself, this righteous victim who dies an unjust death, is raised to the place of judgment. He judges his oppressors. It's an ingenious development, and I think sort of is the backdrop perhaps to some of the ways in which Jesus understands his own life and what is coming. In a sense, it expresses the notion that Jesus, as he approaches Jerusalem, he anticipates to be rejected, to suffer, and to die. But the use of the term Son of Man also expresses his hope that the cross will not be the end. And I think we hear this on the lips of Jesus, and in fact, that is how the story unfolds. Finally, I want to give some brief consideration to the Jesus' use of parables. It's something that is quite distinctive to Jesus, or closely identified with him. Probably no pedagogical teaching method of Jesus is more associated to him, more closely associated to him than his use of parables. Jesus' parables are Jewish. We want to sort of look at them a little bit more closely. I've been involved in parables study for the last 6 or 7 years. In 2011, I published a collection with a Jewish scholar. No one had ever gone in and collected the earliest Jewish parables that appear in rabbinic literature. So we collected them, I translated them, and then we published them, 456 of the earliest Jewish parables. And it was fascinating, because once you have this collection, this anthology, this corpus of parables, in literary terms, it means that you need to take a step back and look at Jesus' parables in light of this broader collection, to ask questions about usage and what might be meant by the parables themselves. We tend to sort of pull Jesus' parables out of their cultural context, out of their linguistic context, out of their historical context, and interpret them as we like. That's one of the aspects of a parable. A parable is a metaphor. It represents something. And of course, depending on who's looking at it, who wants to read into the parable, the various interpretations of the images, you can interpret a parable however you like. This is why we'll have 57 different sermons on the same parable, taking us in completely different directions. Because in some ways, a parable can serves sort of like a mirror. It's a reflection of who we are and what we bring to our interpretation of that particular story parable. But there's a different process here of asking the question, what might Jesus have meant when he told that parable in the first century setting in a particular historical, cultural, and linguistic context? And for that, I think this collection is useful in trying to unpack the meaning of Jesus' parables. I delivered a paper a couple of years ago at the National Conference for the Society of Biblical Literature. It was a session on the historical Jesus. The theme of the session was parables in the historical Jesus. There were 5 of us who were invited to present about parables. I chose to speak about reading the parables as Jewish literature because that's what I do. And before I challenged my colleagues that before we can actually begin to talk about Jesus' parables, we have to lay the groundwork of what a parable is and the sort of the intrinsic nature of a parable. Otherwise, if we don't have common ground and a common understanding of the structure and the assumptions regarding what a parable is, we likely will not come to any agreement as to what Jesus is trying to say or how the parables speak to us regarding the historical Jesus. So I laid out, in the beginning, what I considered 7 characteristics of Jewish parables that also need to be taken into account in our reading of the gospel parables. The first one, which is something I think people were not familiar with, is the fact that the term itself, whether we're speaking in Hebrew, mashal, or its Greek equivalent, parabole, for story parables like we have in the New Testament, this begins really from the New Testament period. The first recorded evidence we have of a story parable being called a parable is actually in the Gospels. That doesn't mean that's the first time, but that's the first time we have recorded it. It may have been in the century before. We just don't have it written down. But the important thing is to recognize that this terminology itself, even of parable, or in Hebrew mashal, for a story parable, which is generally how we describe what we have in the Gospels, is a post-biblical, post-Old Testament development. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, parables, and we do have 3 or 4, are not called mashal. They are not called a parable. In fact, the term mashal in Hebrew in the Old Testament is used for other things. It's used for Proverbs. The book of Proverbs in Hebrew is called Mishlei Shlomo, the parables or the Proverbs of Solomon. It's also used for oracles or prophecies. I can think of the prophecy of Balaam in Numbers is called a mashal. It's used for wise sayings, but never for a story parable, like the parable that Nathan tells to David. Lovely parable with a moral, but it's not called a mashal. Or the disappointing vineyard in Isaiah 5, lovely parable, good moral. It fits the pattern of what we would expect for a Jewish parable, but it's not called a parable, a mashal. So the terminology that we have where we actually use the term parabole, parable, or mashal for these small short stories with a moral or a conclusion to it, with an instruction at the end of it, is something that is a development that occurs around the New Testament period. The second thing is that parables, as a genre, as distinctive literary units, only appear in the Gospels and rabbinic literature. This is a fascinating thing because we have different bodies of literature, Jewish literature, in the first century and the Second Temple period, We have the writings, extensive writings of Josephus, the Jewish historian. We have the Jewish philosopher Philo. We have many Jewish works from the period between the Testaments, Apocrypha, Jewish pseudepigrapha. We have almost 1,000 scrolls from the Dead Sea area, the Qumran community, the Dead Sea Scrolls. No parables in any of those. The only parables we have show up in the in rabbinic literature and the Gospels, and that I think is important, because as we try to ask ourselves, where is Jesus most comfortable in the landscape of Jewish thought? Where does he belong? I think the world of Jesus is most closely associated, the spiritual world of Jesus is most closely associated with the spiritual world of the sages, the rabbis. That's where he seems to, his ideas, his manner of speaking, his actions seem to fit most closely. And I think parables are an indication of that. I find remarkable at times scholars of world standing who write books on parables and do not cite a single parable. One of my favorite examples is the little book by C.H. Dodd. He was a New Testament scholar from a previous generation, middle of the 20th century. Really fine scholar. Was considered one of the leading New Testament scholars of his time. Wrote a book on called The Parables of the Kingdom. And so he writes an entire book about a genre of literature, literary units that only appear in the Gospels and rabbinic literature, and particularly about parables that concern the kingdom of heaven, Malchut Shamayim, an expression that only appears in rabbinic literature, again, doesn't appear in Josephus and Philo and the Dead Sea Scrolls or in Apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, but only in rabbinic literature. So he writes an entire volume about parables and concerning the kingdom of heaven, and he's able to do so without citing a single parable from rabbinic literature. That says something about the tunnel vision of New Testament scholarship, which I'm trying to challenge and address in my own writings that I'm working on. Thirdly, all parables are told in Hebrew. This is probably one of the most striking, stark elements. Routinely, almost everything that you'll read, probably even in the literature that you're reading for this course, they'll speak of Jesus' parables in Aramaic. We have no parables in Aramaic, period, zero, none. In our collection of 456 of the earliest Jewish parables, they all are in Hebrew. All. Not a single Aramaic parable. Of course, the gospel parables that we have are in New Testament, because the words and teachings of Jesus, which undoubtedly were delivered in Hebrew, have been translated and recorded, preserved in the Greek Gospels. So what we have are in Greek, but oftentimes you can tell from the nature of the language of the Greek language of the Gospels that they reflect a Semitic language, language environment. They earlier stage probably were expressed in Hebrew language, but are now recorded in Greek. But it's an important thing to point out again that we have no parables in Aramaic, not a single one. Even in Jewish literature that is in Aramaic, when it comes to telling a parable, it will always revert back to Hebrew. In Jewish tradition, one always tells parables in Hebrew, and in my opinion, Jesus is not an exception here. He undoubtedly told his parables in Hebrew. Just for the record, I think Jesus was probably a multilingual, spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, but when it came time to his teachings, I think he likely shifted into Hebrew. Hebrew would be the distinctive language of the Jewish people. Aramaic is the lingua franca of the Near East. We have language influences in the land of Israel, from the east Aramaic and from the west Greek. All three languages are evident in our inscriptions and other evidence that we have. It was a trilingual environment, but it's important to underscore when we speak of parables, Jesus undoubtedly told those in Hebrew. The settings for the parables are universal. They speak of a father, son, two brothers. We hear about a master and his servants, elements that are universal and not distinctively Jewish. In other words, we don't have synagogues, no rabbis, Jerusalem, the temple. We don't deal with legal matters, halakhic matters for the most part. In our collection, there are literally a handful of exceptions to that, but and I do mean probably less than 5 out of 456, but on the whole, they do not deal with any issues of the commandments or legal matters. They are stories that could be told in Sweden or in Ireland or anywhere really. They're very universal in their settings and the characters that appear in the parables. The purpose of parables is to simplify. This is probably one of the great misunderstandings of Christians regarding parables. There is, and I know where it comes from. I know why this thinking has developed. I'm actually working right now on a book on gospel parables, and this is one of the more important chapters, is to try to explain to Christians how this mistaken idea develops, the idea that Jesus somehow told parables to keep secrets, that parables were intended for insiders and were intended to keep outsiders in the dark, in a sense. This is totally contrary to the cultural understanding of parables. In Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, there's nothing that resembles this idea. Instead, parables are intended to explain sublime ideas like the kingdom of heaven in very earthy, simple terms, oftentimes agrarian, agriculture, family life. It's to bring those things down, those ideas down, on a level that even the uneducated can grasp them. That is the purpose for parables. And Jesus, I think, does the same thing. He uses fishing and farming and human relationships to try to explain theological ideas. Parables are the vehicle for expressing theological ideas. So if you want to learn the theology of Jesus, learn the parables. In the parables, you have the theological content of the Gospels. Parables are, by nature, popular stories. They don't grow out of a world of scholarship, of years spent in the Beit Midrash, in the house of study, the yeshiva. They don't. You don't have to spend 20 years in the house of study and poring over the scriptures to be able to tell a parable. Essentially, anyone can tell a parable. You just need to be a good storyteller. And I think to some extent, this is why the parable does not have a lot of does not get a lot of esteem within rabbinic circles in the early years. What we find in parables is that in time the rabbis sort of reshape them to make them more acceptable to a Torah-centered world. They began to reshape the parables to be used in scripture interpretation, but in their early stages, that is not the nature of the parable. Both in the early Jewish parables and also by and large in the gospel parables, you'll notice that there's no scripture attached to them. There may be scripture in the background, sort of as a backdrop, but not in terms of citation or up front at the center of the parables. The We find as well that Jesus, I think that whole idea of the popular nature of the parable is reflected in our Gospels, that Jesus generally does not tell parables in the synagogue, which would have been the place of study. Instead, they're at meals, encounters on the road. They are popular stories that grow out of social interaction, and they're not instruments used in the house of study. Finally, I think it's important to highlight that many of the early Jewish parables, like the gospel parables themselves, reflect something of the values and priorities of a spiritual movement, a pietistic movement in the Galilee. These were individuals who were wonder workers, the Hasidim. We refer to them as, not to be confused with modern day Hasidic Judaism. This is a different movement. We call it in Hebrew Hasidim Rishonim, the first Hasidim. These were pious wonder workers who were understood to have a special relationship with God, such that when they prayed, God would hear their prayers and answer immediately. They are about the business of exorcisms, healings, miracles, all activities that the rabbis do not involve themselves in. We don't have any rabbi involved in healing or exorcisms or miracles. This is something only that belongs to the Hasidim, and they have particular priorities in their teachings, their values that are reflected in these early parables. And I think it's important to underscore that, because many of these values are also reflected in the parables of Jesus. It may say something about Jesus sharing some common viewpoints and attitudes with these early Hasidim. So that's our introduction. Again, a little bit about Mark, something of the background and understanding of the Son of Man, and finally the idea of the parables in the Gospels and their place within early Jewish literature. So as you move forward, I hope you're able to move through the assignments, the readings, again, the participation, the discussion question, and finally the test. Remember that the test is drawn, for the most part, from the content of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, the little introduction to Mark, and the 10 questions, and you will be allowed to take that test in the 24-hour window immediately prior to class. It will close at midnight the night before our class. I look forward to talking to you next week, and have a good time in studying Mark's Gospel.